여러분 안녕하십니까? 서울경제신문 뉴욕 특파원 김은록입니다. 오늘 이 자리에는 닥터 아담 포즌 모셨습니다. 지금 세계에서 가장 탑 이코노미스트 중에 한 분이신데요. 지금 현재 피터슨국제경제연구소의 소장을 맡고 계십니다. 이전에 연준에도 근무를 하셨고요. 이코노미스트로서. 그리고 이전에 이제 영국은행의 영란은행, 영국중앙은행, 뱅크 오브 잉글랜드의 통화정책결정위원회 외부위원으로도 계셨습니다. 그리고 일본 정부, 일본 중앙은행, 그리고 이제 뭐 미국을 비롯한 여러 IMF 그리고 여러 국제기관 정부의 자문으로서 조언을 해주셨던 저명한 금융경제 석학이십니다. Nice to meet you, Dr. Posen.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, and thanks to you and Seoul Economic Daily for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin with the Fed. The Fed said it would not cut interest rate during this year after raising the rate to 5.1% this year. But the market is expecting a recession and the Fed to cut rates sometime this year. Do you see a recession this year or coming next year? And should we take Powell's word for it?
I think you should take Powell's word for it. To me, the Fed is very unlikely to cut rates before first quarter of 2024. In fact, I think it is more likely that they'll have to go beyond 5.25 on the short-term rate, maybe as high as 5.75 or 6, in which case they're very unlikely to cut rates by the end of the year. I think there is likely to be a slowdown in U.S. growth. Whether it will be an actual recession or what we call a growth recession, meaning near zero but still positive growth with unemployment rising, is not clear. I think it's more likely to be a small recession, meaning growth in the minus 0.75% range for 2023 into early 2024.
Yeah, you just said that Fed would raise to the 5.6 or 5.7. Is it because of the inflation?
Yes, I think they would they're probably going to pause in February once they get to roughly 5.25 on the short interest rate. But then I think they will look around and it'll turn out that unemployment is still very low and that wages are moderating but still rising, and they will have to do more. I hope that's not the case, but I think it's increasingly likely they will have to do more.
Okay, so it means you have a same idea with Powell. It means Powell think the imbalance of labor market is the problem.
Well, I think Powell is, on his public statements, more optimistic than I am. In that he thinks getting to 5.25 is probably going to be enough. And he is emphasizing more about older workers dropping out, whereas I think there are other things going on in the U.S. labor market. But I do agree with Chair Powell that I think if you're looking at the trend of inflation or what various measures of core inflation, what matters is wages.
Yeah. Okay. My next question is about the world economy. The world except the U.S. had a harder time than the U.S. last year. The oil price and inflation and supply chain problem were equally difficult on the whole world, but the strong dollar has become a big burden on the rest of the country's economy except for U.S. Do you think the pain of the world, including in Korea, will be eased this year?
I think it's going to vary a lot country to country. I think Korea's pain will ease. I think Korea, like Japan and some of your other high-income neighbors, will end up with a slightly stronger currency against the dollar, and you will benefit from the already lower energy and commodity prices. I think given the slowdown in growth in US and Europe and the likely weaker growth in China, that the amount of pain you're talking about in terms of purchasing power is going to be less. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of developing countries that, particularly in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, for whom things will just get worse because the slowdown in US, Europe, China, well, China will be a weak recovery, will not give them many opportunities for growth. Korea should do okay. You might end up with a weaker growth, but I doubt a recession in 2023.
Oh, that's good. Sounds good. But just you said world economy just is slowing down. So, and I'd like to ask you, what do you think are the variables or key factor of global economy or U.S. economy? For example, will the Bank of Japan's policy change to tightening be a shock to the financial market by causing the return of carry trade funds?
I think there's a lot of surprises possibly out there, but the main factors are very clear. It is the Fed's and the European central banks tightening cycles and the effects they're having on their economy. It's the decline in energy demand from China, US, Europe, that means the shortages of supply are being alleviated, made less bad. There's also been, with the exception of semiconductors, a lot of working through some of the supply chain problems of recent years. So I think there's a lot of fundamentals driving the US and world economy right now. And we're going to have relatively benign fiscal policy in most countries. If anything, the US will probably be less stimulative than Europe or China or Japan. So that sense, I'm reasonably confident. I also think that at least in the G7 economies, and I think also in Korea, though I don't know the financial system as well, things are much better regulated and supervised than they were in 2008. And we can see that in the amount of capital and the amount of rolled over lending in the major banks. And we can see that even though the real estate prices are coming down with higher interest rates, it's not causing as much financial distress as it did in previous cycles. So again, I think there's a big fundamental there, putting a floor, some stability underneath the world economy. The Bank of Japan's surprise move on interest rates surprised me too. I was expecting them to widen the band and raise the 10-year JGB rate target in January or even April with the transition of governor there. But it's ultimately not that important.
Okay, I'd like to talk more about Korea and globalization. Free trade is very important to Korea because Korea is a trade-oriented country. Regarding globalization, is the trend of deglobalization centered on the conflict between US and China or US and Russia now irreversible?
It's not irreversible, but it is gaining momentum in the sense that once you have the distrust and the kinds of behavior on both sides, it's very hard to stop it. It being the aggression economically towards one another. I think it was very good to see the courteous and seemingly constructive meeting between President Xi and President Biden around the APEC summit, the G20 summit. And I don't want to say everything's morally equivalent. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is terrible. We had to take action. But as Jessica Chen Weiss, writing in Foreign Affairs, for example, has talked about, if you can have this sort of downward spiral where the US does something aggressive to China in economics, even for good reasons, and then China retaliates, and then trust gets worse. So I think it would require real leadership effort to stop the current cycle. Unfortunately, people in the US Congress and in the Biden administration are pretty anti-trade. So I worry.
Who can have the initiative to do so? Who have to have initiative?
I have been pushing for the last couple of years
Yes.
for East Asian economies to stand up, for Japan and Australia and South Korea and Singapore and Indonesia and New Zealand, and others to stand up. And that means continuing with CPTPP, which I know Korea is considering joining, but also making other deals like the information technology deal that Singapore and New Zealand just led, and helping each other have resilience irrespective of what US and China do. I think that that is the way forward. And if these countries work together, then they can also more credibly tell the US or tell China, we don't have to choose. We want to work with both of you. If they stay alone, it's harder for them to stand up to China and US.
It can be a little bit specific question, but related to the globalization. Now, in Korea, the IRA issue is important. Yeah, so Korean car companies are investing in US, but they cannot get some subsidies from the US government, and this problem, the US, the France and Germany, like Europe country, also have the same critics this problem. Do you have any opinion about this?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible thing, the policy the US government has put in. They have no business treating allies and market economies like South Korea, Japan, or Germany, or France this way. And President Biden said, oh, we didn't really intend that after he was confronted about it, but it's true, they did intend this, and it's wrong. It's bad for the American consumer. It's bad for the American industrial base. It's bad for advancing green technology, and it's unfair to Korea and others. The problem is our Congress passed the law, and so it's very hard now for the American government to adjust the law without going back to Congress and telling them to repeal it. And they don't have the guts to do that. And they didn't fight hard enough against it. They wanted the other parts of the IRA bill, so they gave in on these. And so right now, similarly, there are things they could do at the Treasury or the Commerce Department to make this IRA bill less damaging to allies and less damaging to the electronic vehicle industry, but they won't do it. They'll use Congress as an excuse. So this is a great example of where Korea and others should be standing up to the US and saying this is not right.
Yes, this would be the last question today. Korean economy is greatly influenced by the policies and economic condition of the US and China. And Korea's industry is competing with Japan. So overall, I would like to ask for your advice so that Korea can overcome the current difficulty crisis well.
Well, I think there's room enough for both Japan and Korea in all these industries, whether it's semiconductors or automobiles or shipbuilding or whatever. Both countries have something to contribute, or rather their companies and their workers have something to contribute. I think it is very unfortunate that Korea and Japan's governments have gotten into a diplomatic problem starting a few years ago. And I was hopeful that with the change in the Blue House and the change of prime minister in Japan, that could be resolved. I see some signs that the governments are being more pragmatic and cooperative. But I also don't think long-term Korea and Japan have much more common interest. They have common interest in stability in the region. They have common interest in good military ties with the US. They have common interest in open competition so that their good companies can succeed. They have common interest in getting better technologies to adapt to climate change or mitigate climate change problems.
Yeah.
So I don't want to talk about it in terms of how Korea can better compete against Japan. I'd rather have it be, how can Korea and Japan create an environment together with others that lets their companies do their best?
Yeah. Oh, it's very valuable advice. Thank you for the advice and thank you for your time today, and Happy New Year. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Thank you to Seoul Economic Daily. Happy New Year to everyone watching.